Good morning, Morai V'Rabotai, B'ruchim Habayim. We are continuing on Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and I'm going to go back to where we left off at the bottom of Yud Bet, Amud Bet, 10 lines up from the bottom of the Amud, Tenan Hatam. Today's Amud is being learned as a Zechut Rufa Shel Mafor, Daniel Moshe ben Farangis V'Avraham, Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid, Shira Bat Chemda, and his Amud has also been learned, the Ilui Nishmat, Shlomo ben Yaakov. This month's learning of the community has been dedicated graciously by the Shea family and Mahubi family. This should be an ultimate zechut for all of their mishpachot. Amen. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what you guys have been learning in the past week or so. And this really culminates the discussion that we started beforehand, and now we're going to get into a lot of gishmak sugyas of Yashan and much of what we know about it, which is really tucked away in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara Teran Hatam Hatiltan. We're going to have a lot of Teran Hatams over here. A lot of quotations of different Mishnayot and Gemarot. So here we have a Mishnah from Masrot. Tenan Hatam Hatiltan Mishet Tismach. Rashi says Tiltan is fenugreek, right? It's, in other words, known as fenugreek, the shambalile that the Eastern culture uses a lot in different stews and foods. So where do you start the clock for it, right? Mishet Titzmach, it starts from the time that it starts growing. Now we're going to see in the Gemara what that means exactly. Titzmach, what does it mean? When is Titzmach when it grows, and Mishaviu Shalish when they have reached a third of their full growth. What does that mean? That fenugreek is from the time that it grows. Mishet Titzmach Lizraim. It is talking about a time that it grows when it has its seeds already grown in it, right? The fenugreek seeds that is harvested from the time that grows in it. That's when it is Mishet Titzmach. The produce and also olives from the time that they reach a third of their growth. Who said? How do you know that? So it says the Gemara. You're going to have a whole loop over here of a Gemara bringing. I'm just going to give you the overview of what's going to happen the entire Amud. The Gemara is going to bring a raya, and the Gemara is going to deal with that raya, and at the end of next Amud, the Gemara is going to fall off of this raya because of a question that can't be answered, and then the Gemara is going to attempt a different raya. But the first thing that the Gemara brings is from a pasuk in Chag HaAsif, in Chag HaSukkot, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Asi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Umatuba Mishmed Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, and there are those who say it in the name of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Mikes Sheva Shanim B'moed Shnat HaShemitah, at the end of 7 years, when it is the Shemitah year, right, when it's the sabbatical year, B'Chag HaSukkot, in Chag HaSukkot, Shnat HaShemitah, in the year of Shemitah, and says the Gemara, wait, look at the calendar. At the end of 7th year, the 7th year finishes when? Legabe Shmitot veYovel, we spend a whole daf on this, on Rosh Chodesh, Tishrei. Chag HaSukkot is how many days after that? 15 days after that. So it's 15 days into the 8th year. So why are you telling me that that's not the Shemitah if it's already the 8th year? Right? We were trying to be relieved from the stress of Shemitah here, and now we want to get to work in the next year. It's Shnat Shemona, not Shnat Sheva. So why is the Pasuk calling this Shnat Sheva, Shnat Shemitah, when you're talking about at the end of Shemitah, Bechag HaSukkot, which is 15 days after the end of Shnat Shemitah? This is like a bomb kasha. How in the world are you calling Chag HaSukkot of the 8th year Shnat Shemitah? So says the Gemara, Sheminiti is the 8th year. But it's coming to teach you. In other words, it is talking about the 8th year, but it's coming to teach you something important. Kol tevuah shehevi'ah shlish b'shvi'it. Any produce that has already filled a third of its growth in the 7th year, it's attributed to the 7th year. Even if you are going to harvest it in the 8th year, right? When you gather it. Now, by the way, how do we know third, not third? We don't. Rashi says, look, Ayin Sham later on, the Gemara is going to discuss how we know from this pasuk, what portion, the third. But the concept we learn from this pasuk is, you could have 8th year in Chag HaSukkot that is dealt with as the 7th year. Right? Because it's standing in Sukkot and it's calling it Shnat Shemitah. Which obviously is not. Obviously, this is the 8th year. So why am I calling this Shnat Shemitah? It's coming to teach you that when certain amount of the growth of the produce was done in Shnat Shemitah, this produce is a Shnat Shemitah produce. I don't care when you're going to harvest it from the ground, it is going to be attributed to Shnat Shemitah. That's Pashut. Now, the third, we're going to see why and how. Any produce that has grown a third of its growth in Shnat Shemitah, in the 7th year, Lifnei Rosh Hashanah, before Rosh Hashanah, which is the end of the official end of the 7th year, Ata noheg ba minak shvi'it. You have to deal with it as a 7th year produce. Even though that it's b'sheminit. Even though that you're harvesting it in sheminit. Is that clear? This is like a clear-cut, beautiful, beautiful drasha. Okay? And there's no two ways about it. Because the pasuk is calling the 8th year the 7th year. Right? Says Gemara, Rabbi Yisraeli says to Rabasi, how do you know the third then? Maybe anything that started growing in the 7th year, even a little bit, a tiny bit, is going to already be attributed to the 7th year. Who says third, fourth? Who says? How do you know the third? Maybe as long as it rooted and it started growing in the 7th, should be attributed to the 7th. Because according to what we're saying right now, if it roots in the 7th year, but it grows its first third in Shnat Shemona, in the 8th year, it's already 8th year. I don't care that it rooted in Shnat Shemitah. It has to have its initial third of its growth in Shemitah year for it to be attributed to Shemitah. Says Rabbi Yisraeli, who says, where do you get this magical number of third from? Maybe as long as it roots in Shnat Shemitah, we say, okay, this is Shemitah year produce. Right? Says the Gemara, the Kama Rachmana, the Shamet, maybe, the Torah is telling you, you should be noheg min hak shmita to this produce that rooted in, started growing in the 7th year. And Kama Rachmana, the Shamet v'tez, maybe the pasuk is coming to tell you that the Shnat Shemitah is extended until Chag HaSukkot. Right, we spoke about the Tosefet Shemitah, right? You remember the whole thing of Tosefet Shemitah? So maybe Tosefet Shemitah is until Chag HaSukkot. That's why the pasuk says the Shemini is called really Shnat HaShemitah, it's coming to tell you that anything that grows, any growth in those 15 days from Rosh Hashanah until Chag HaSukkot is part and parcel of Shemitah. Shemitah extends itself 15 days into the new year. Right? As a Tosefet Shvit. Right? How do you know? Says the Gemara, Lo sal kadatach. You cannot say that. Why? Dichtiv, because it says, V'chag ha'asif beset hashana. Chag ha'asif beset hashana. It's a repeated word in the pasuk. The full pasuk reads, V'chag ha'katzir bikure ma'asecha asher tizra basadeh. Right? That's speaking about Shavuot. V'chag ha'asif beset hashana. And Chag ha'asif is the end of the year. The end of the year. We can come back to those words. And then he repeats again, Be'osvecha et ma'asecha min hasadeh. Why do you have to repeat it? You're calling it Chag ha'asif. Why do you need to call it Chag ha'asif if literally the next word is Be'osvecha et ma'asecha min hasadeh? It's when you gather your produce from the field. Now, parenthetically, just for us to understand, every Chag obviously has its nickname based on what was happening with the produce in the land at that moment, right? Chag HaPesach is called the Chag of the growth, the blossoming, the beginning of the things is Chag Aviv. And Chag HaShavuot is Chag HaKatzir. What do you do with it when we harvest it? You can't take it in because it's natural moisture that's going to rot away and get moldy. So they would put it for the next few months, just spread on the ground in the field to completely dry. And then before the rain season, they would take it in Chag HaAsif. Right? So says the pasuk, Chag HaAsif be'osvecha et vatcha min hasadeh. So if you're telling me what happens, why do you have to call it Chag HaAsif? You just told me that, right? Why are you mentioning it twice in the same pasuk? Says the Gemara, Ilema Chag haba bizman asifa. If you want to tell me that Chag HaAsif means the Chag that comes in the time of Asifa, haketiv b'osvecha. It says at the end of the same pasuk, b'osvecha tu vatcha min hasadeh. So you can't be telling me that because that's already explicitly mentioned in the same pasuk, literally in the same pasuk. So therefore, Ela my asif kasir. Right? When the Chumash says Chag ha'asif, it doesn't mean asif, it means kasir. That means another way of understanding asif is when you gather, when you harvest. Right? So this Chag HaAsif is coming to tell you, says the Gemara, that there is an element of harvest also in Chag HaSukkot. Generally speaking, Chag HaSukkot is Chag HaAsif because you have harvested on Shavuot and now you're gathering them into the silos, in the storage houses. But there's an element of harvest itself in Chag HaSukkot. What is the element of harvest in Chag HaSukkot? Says the Gemara, Vekim leu lerabanan, Chachamim have this Kabbalah, they understand, they are baki, they call tvuah sheniktzara bechag, that any produce that is ready for harvest in Chag HaSukkot, beyadua she'evia shelish lifnei Rosh Hashanah, is for sure that it already had a third of its growth 15 days ago, on Rosh Hashanah. And here is the punchline, and the pasuk is calling it Betzet Hashana. Right? Remember, the full pasuk is Hakatzir Bikure Ma'asecha Asher Tizra Basadeh V'Chag HaAsif Betzet Hashana. It calls Chag HaSukkot the end of the year. Betzet Hashana. Betzet Hashana was when? 15 days ago, Baba. Right? It was 15 days ago, and yet you're calling Chag HaSukkot Beset Hashana. Says the Gemara, that is coming to tell you that the end between Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, if anything, you harvest in Chag HaSukkot, means that it has already been completing its third of its growth in prior to Rosh Hashanah, in the previous year, and that the pasuk says Beset Hashanah goes after the previous year. That is considered the year that went out. Even though that I'm 15 days in, I'm going to call this tefillah that I harvested in Chag HaSukkot, Beset Hashanah goes after the previous year, because by the Set Hashanah, by the exit of the previous year, he already had a shlish, he already was, grown enough that he was ready for a third. And that's the drasha, right? So this is what we're sticking with until the end of this Amud, where we have to change it, right? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera were a student and Rabbi Zera was a Rabbi of Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? They have a lot of very interesting encounters in Shas, and Rabbi Yirmiyah is a very interesting person, actually. First of all, their natures were very different. You find this, that Rabbi Zera was more of a serious person. Rabbi Yirmiyah was a very happy person. You find him in Shas trying to make his Rabbi Zera happy, to make him say things that are very funny, and so on. But Rabbi Yirmiyah also was very meticulous in details. Too much details, so much so that the Gemara says you see it in Gemara Masachet Nida Daf Chav Gimel. You find it in Masachet Batra, also in Daf Chav Gimel, happens to be actually, right? In Masachet Batra, there's a discussion of birds that they've fallen off of their nest. How far do they go? Because the Gemara says, it's talking about ownerships, obviously, and the Gemara says they look back to see their shovach, their nest. They don't go farther, they go up to 50 amot, right? So the Rebbe says, well, what if you find this bird? Because anything further than that, right, taking ownership of it would be very different than when it's next to its shovach, next to its nest. So it says, Rebbe, what if you find a bird that 1 foot is before the 50, 1 foot is after the 50? The Gemara says, the Chachamim of the Bet Midrash got frustrated enough with Rabbi Yirmiyah. Al da'afku Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Bet Midrash. They kicked him out of Bet Midrash. Say, what kind of question is that, right? Well, 1 foot is, it's 50. All the shiurim of Chazal is like that. So this is very similar to that. Says Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Zera, he says, wait a second. V'kim leu l'Rabbanan ben shalish l'pachot mi shalish. Really? For this, you have to know this is day to day, right? You're saying a general rule, it's a good question. You're saying a general rule that anything that by Chag HaSukkot is ready for harvest, Beyadua for sure guaranteed that 15 days ago it already had a third of its growth. That's very hard to say. Chachamim are such bikim in, we know such things that everything that's ready to be harvested 15 days ago was already ready. Third, Amaleh, Rabbi Zera tells him, says, did I tell you not to ask these types of questions? Lo amina lecha, did I tell you? Look, again, once you know the history, the Shas history of Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera, it's much more, it really fits right in to the narrative, right? So I told you, don't ask these types of questions. Lo tapik nafshach lebar meilcheta. Don't deviate from the halacha that you're told. Kol midot chachamim kachu. All of the midot, all the measurements of chachamim is like very exact, and you're going to ask questions like this. For instance, he gives an example. Be'arba'im se'ah hu tovil, right? The shiur of mikveh is arba'im se'ah, right? It's a shiur that a normal person could fit himself into, right? Ama berum shalosh amot, right? 1 amah to 1 amah, height of 3 amot. That's the normal person. So you're going to ask, arba'im se'ah, how about arba'im se'ah minus a kortov? Kortov is very small amount of water, right? Imagine we have revi'it, right? 3 ounces is a revi'it, 1/4 of a log. This is 1/64 of a log, right? That's a kortov. Arba'im chaser kortov. If you have a little bit less than arba'im, kasher or pasul, you can't. Of course, it's pasul, right? It's a minute. Doesn't make a difference. That's all the shiurim of Chazal is like that, right? Same is with the next one, right? Kabetza metameh, by tumat ochalim, right? For a food to be metameh, another food, it needs to be the smallest amount of betabiliyah is kabetza, right? So kabetza is metameh. Kabetza that's tameh is metameh, another ochel, another food item. Kabetza chaser shum shum. If you have a sesame seed measurement less than a kabetza, it's not metameh. It's not. That's how it works, right? Says the Gemara. A third example. Shlosha al shlosha metameh midras. For a beged to be tameh tumat midras, for a zav, for a zava, it has to be 3 tfachim on 3 tfachim, right? But if it is 3 tfachim on 3 tfachim, and you take one thread from one side, and you just take that thread out, now it's shlosha tfachim al shlosha tfachim chaser, one thread is less, one thread less than 3 tfachim on 3 tfachim, and you ask yourself, is that different? Yes, it is. That's how all the shiurim of Chazal is, right? Shlosha al shlosha chaser nima achat, one thread less, eino metameh midras, is not metameh tumat midras. So that's the answer, the strong answer Rabbi Yisraeli gave Rabbi Yirmiyah. But then the Gemara says Rabbi Yirmiyah himself went back and he said, what I said is really not even a question. Because I have a proof that Chazal actually knew. Chazal and Tao Yoshua, you find already, that they knew even within few short days the difference between a third of growth and ready for harvest. So once they knew it in the time of Yoshua, we could tell that Chachamim know these types of things, right? Hadar Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah himself went back and said, Lav milta hidam. What I said is not true. The Baal Minei Chavraya Mirav Kana, I prove it to you, because the Chachmei Bet Midrash asked Rabbi Kana, Omer Sheikru Yisrael Bechnisatan La'ares Mehechan Ikrivu. Korban Omer that they brought in the first year that the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael, where did they bring it from? Now, quiz. What day of the Hebrew calendar did the Jews enter Eretz Yisrael? Let's see who knows. No, seriously? Huh? It's a pasuk in Tanakh. Boba. Right? The 10th day of Nisan. Right? 10th day of Nisan of the 40th year, they entered Eretz Yisrael. Korban Omer is brought when? Huh? Second ever, 16th day of Nisan. So 6 days you have. 5 days you really have, right? Because of the harvest. You have 5 days between they coming in and having to bring Korban Omer. Did they bring Korban Omer? Well, let's see. Says the Gemara, and this is all Rabbi Yirmiyah talking. Right? They asked this question to Rabbi Kana in the Bet Midrash. Im tomar te'ayil beyad nochri. If you say that they went just to the store and they bought some barley and they brought, you can't do that because it says ketzirchem. It has to be your tvuah, your harvest, right? Amar Rachmana v'lo ketzir nochri. It can't be something that the goy harvested, right? So says the Gemara, my doctor, who says they even brought Korban Omer? Maybe that year they didn't bring Korban Omer, right? But so says, no, you can't say that because it says in the pasuk, Lo sal kadatach, tichtiv, vayochlo ma'avur ha'aretz, not ma'avor, but ma'avur. Avur is tvuah, another word for tvuah, for produce, right? They ate from the produce of Eretz Yisrael, mimachorat ha'pesach. Only the day after Pesach, they started eating from the tevuah. Why? Because beforehand, it was chadash, right? Anyone has any questions that you can't eat chadash here? Right? Everyone knows already that chadash is asur d'oraita. Right? You got like 1 week of shiurim on this. You're like chadashed out, right? So, but that's what it is. It says they couldn't eat before this korban that they started eating from the tevuah of the land from the day after Pesach, which means beforehand they were not eating. So if beforehand they were not eating, afterwards they were eating, it means they brought korban omer, pashut, right? So says the Gemara, Mimachorat Pesach, achul meikara lo achul. Tomorrow they ate, tomorrow of Pesach, but beforehand they were not eating it. Those 5-6 days initially, they were not eating anything, right? They akrivu omer, vehadar achli. They brought korban omer, and then they started eating. Right, so back to square one. Mehechani krivu. How did they have korban? It's not kitzilchem. You hear a catch-22 over here, you're stuck. They brought korban omer, but it has to be kitzilchem to be bringing korban omer. So how does that work exactly? Rav Kana answered. This was the question they posed to Rav Kana. Rabbi Yirmiyah is quoting this that happened. He says, this is what happened in the Beit Midrash of Rav Kana. Amar lahen, Rav Kana answered the Chachmei Beit Midrash who asked him this question, Kol shelo hevi shelish biyad nochri, any time that the tvuah did not fill its third of its growth in the hand of a goy, and then the Jews took over, so when it became a third of its growth, it was the ownership of a Jew, that's considered your tvuah. If it already was a third of its growth in the hand of in the ownership of a nochri, then you cannot bring korban omer from it. That's not kitzirchem anymore. That's a tvuah of a nochri. Right? And we're talking about 6 days over here. Right? When they entered the land and took over, it was not shlish, and now it is shlish. So you see, even within 5, 6, for 15 days, even in 5 days, they know the difference. Right? So it says Rabbi Yirmiyah, I take it back. I retract. I said, how do you know that they knew? They knew. However, they knew the difference between a third and another third. Even within 5 days, they knew it. Forget about 15 days. Says the Gemara. We should ask this question. Maybe it was third and they didn't know. From here that they know the difference. Even in 5 days, they know the difference of a third, not a third. And therefore, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, over here also within 15 days, from Rosh Hashanah until Sukkot, it's fair to say that Chachamim knew that anything that's ready for harvest and Chag HaSukkot by Rosh Hashanah already was third. Fine. The Gemara says now the Gemara is going to ask Rabbi Yirmiyah, says no. If you have this question, this is not an answer, right? We think it's very good, right? The Gemara says no. V'dilma lo ayir klal. Maybe it didn't even grow anything. Right? Maybe they came to Eretz Yisrael and the tvuah was not grown at all. You must say, no, you can't say that. Right? But if it grew a fourth, right? And then it became third in the hand of a Jew, maybe that would be good. Right? Maybe they Chazal don't really know the difference between the fourth and the third, but they came to Eretz Yisrael and nothing had grown at all. Right? Maybe that's what it is. Gemara says, what? You can't say that. It's a pasuk. They came out of Yarden, entered Eretz Yisrael, be'asor lachodesh, 10th day of Nisan, right? If you tell me that the produce didn't grow at all, in 5 days it grew the whole thing, right? How is that possible? Of course it's not sayable, right? Elamai, the Gemara says what? What you say is any better? Elamai, the Ayil Riva, you're telling me that it was a fourth of its growth, and now it grew 3/4 of its growth in 5 days. That's also equally bad, right? Or 1/6 and 5/6 of its growth. Still, in 5 days it grew 3/4 or 5/6 of its growth. That's also not sayable. But what do you have to say? We have to say Eres Sviktiv. Right? Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz Tzvi. Everything is fast in Eretz Yisrael, right? When Eretz Yisrael was with the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael coming in, right? Shanim ketiknan Yisrael al admatan, everything was fruits were massive, things were luscious, it was amazing, and it was fast. So it grew 3/4 of its thing in 5 days. So if you're okay saying that it grew 3/4 of its growth in 5 days, you could say 4/4 also, right? So therefore, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah Chazak Baruch, he said good, but the Gemara said no, right? Es ktivba hachanami eres svi ktivba. And this is the end of our discussion with the Yirmiyah. Now the Gemara is going to actually ask a massive question on this whole Amud that we learned, fall off of that and bring a new raya. How do we know this thing? And Be'ezrat Hashem will continue that tomorrow morning. Chazak Baruch.